A new poll suggests President Hamid Karzai will struggle to win the upcoming election in Afghanistan outright. But as the race tightens, what does a runoff mean for the incumbent president? And what are his chances of gaining support in a war-torn country? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mariam Namazi. Afghans are heading to the polls next week in the country's second presidential elections. To win, a candidate has to get over 50% of the vote. Hamid Karzai is standing for re-election. He won in 2004 with a 54% majority. But a poll out this month suggests it may not be as easy for him this time round. A US-funded survey polled over 3,500 people. The poll gives Karzai around 36% of the vote, and it shows his nearest rival, Abdullah, gaining around 20%. There are more than 40 candidates in the presidential race, and that's likely to split the vote. If no candidate gets over 50% of the vote, then the two with the highest number of ballots will go head-to-head in a second round, which could be worrying for the current president. Well, joining us now are our guests. In Kabul, Dawood Sultanzoy, he's an independent member of the parliament. And in Birmingham in the UK, Scott Lucas. He's a professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham and editor of the online current affairs site EnduringAmerica.com. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Mr. Sultanzoy, if I can start with you. Hamid Karzai has, for the past year, been trying to convince tribal leaders and the strong men who are in control of the country to back him by promising them jobs and provincial posts. And at one point, the pundits were almost certain that he was going to be the one to win this election. But now, with the election just a week away, is that still the case?
I think Mr. Karzai's situation has been weakened by some of the people who are considered by him part of his team, while they portray themselves part of his team, but sometimes they do things that are contrary to his interest and to the interest of the country. And I think they have not served them very well. And I hope that he has realized that, and that's why he has faced what he has faced so far. Otherwise, in the beginning, he started on a very, very nice path. The path was very, very welcomed by the people of this country, and we were very hopeful that we will be part of this success with him, and we lent our hand. And whoever becomes the president again, if they start anew with a new vision and with a new start, with a good team, we will again support him. The people of this country cannot afford to lose golden opportunities that are availed them once in a lifetime. So Mr. Karzai is suffering because of the poor performance of his team.
Professor Lucas, many observers now believe that Dr. Abdullah and Hamid Karzai are the only ones who have a real chance of winning this election, that it's essentially a two-horse race. Abdullah has surprised many people with his strong showing. Are you at all surprised by his sudden rise to prominence?
No, I'm not surprised. Abdullah has been not only a national but an international figure in terms of his prominence, his representation through the Northern Alliance in the new Afghanistan. He's very well spoken, he's very eloquent. I think the question has always been, does he command national support as opposed to, let us say, more regional support in the north of the country, and especially among the Tajik community? The thing is, when, as you mentioned, you have 41 candidates, it's very easy to rise to prominence if you're number two. The real question is going to be is if it's a showdown between him and Mr. Karzai, can Abdullah command more than half the vote in a second-round election?
Mr. Sultanzoy, is it also about widespread disillusionment and anger with the current regime in Kabul that has put Dr. Abdullah in a fairly strong position? Is it to a certain extent not so much what Abdullah is offering, but the fact that many people there want change?
I think here we have a situation that most people are not voting for another candidate because they are for that candidate, but most of the people may be looking for something against the incumbent, which is usually sometimes the case in every country where the incumbent has had problems and People want to go somewhere else for something better. And even if something better is not there, sometimes people vote against a candidate and the other candidate benefits from that.
Professor Lucas, it may very much be a two-horse race, but what about the role of the other candidates in being kingmakers? For example, Ashraf Ghani is someone who is viewed as a brilliant intellectual. He's been widely praised in the international community. He was, of course, Karzai's former finance minister. And one thing that's very much in his favor is that he is an ethnic Pashtun. And because of that, presumably both Karzai and Dr. Abdullah will want to do deals with him.
I think that's a very interesting question, because one of the features in this election has been trying to strike deals, even with other candidates, in a sense quiet deals which say, look, we'll work together and then I'll get your vote if there's a second round. The latest story coming out of the United States is that the Americans are favoring a deal in which Mr. Ghani would be Mr. Karzai's chief executive in a new government. Now, this is not an entirely new proposal, in that the Americans several months ago, partly because they have leveled charges of corruption and mismanagement, Mr. Karzai, have been saying to him, look, if you accept a chief executive, we'll accept you as president and we'll move on. So this is almost a dream scenario in which, behind the scenes, Ghani and Karzai strike a deal even before the first round election, which says, look, if Karzai receives less than 50% of the votes, Ghani's supporters will swing behind Karzai, Ghani will become chief executive, they both will be happy, the Americans will both be happy, and supposedly in a dream world, all these issues of corruption and mismanagement will disappear.
Mr. Sultanzoy, what do you make of that proposal? Because there have been reports for a while now that Karzai has tried to lure Ashraf Ghani to his side by offering him the post of chief executive, which could well be a key future role in the next government. Will Ashraf Ghani give in?
Well, Mr. Ghani had a very prominent position in Mr. Karzai's team as the finance minister. Also, even before that, he was a very close confidant of Mr. Karzai. So he has experienced that kind of proximity to Mr. Karzai. But in this whole discussion, one thing that is missing, the missing link is what about the people of Afghanistan? If all these wheelings and dealings are taking place for jockeying positions and the people are forgotten, then these elections will become about personalities who want power, not people. And I think this experience that we are embarking on as a young democracy should reinforce the role of the people here. And I think the numerous candidates here are going to be turned into wild cards, may create other problems that we are not foreseeing right now, like ethnic problems, like regional problems, and so forth. Well,
we're going to discuss some of those issues in just a moment. Now, the commander of NATO forces in Afghanistan has hinted that he could be open to talking to the Taliban. In an interview at one of the country's military bases, he said, quote, "I would absolutely be comfortable with fighters and lower-level commanders making the decision to reintegrate into the Afghan political process." Now, that came just a day after Hamid Karzai suggested a similar course of action, as Hashim Ahlabarra now reports.
As the election campaign reaches its final stage, President Karzai is playing a card he hopes may win him more public support and more leverage over his main rival, Dr. Abdullah. In his manifesto, Karzai has invited the Taliban to a lawyer jirga, Afghanistan's most influential gathering of elders and tribal leaders. It's an attempt to break the political deadlock.
If I am re-elected, I will immediately call for a lower jirga of all people of Afghanistan, and through this lower jirga, we will send an invitation to our brothers in Taliban and Islamic Party to come and participate with their fellow Afghan to find a way for peace and security.
Karzai's repeated calls for talks with his arch-enemies come amid signs that the US administration thinks dialogue with the Taliban could perhaps lead to permanent stability. 8 years after they were driven from power, the Taliban are still a major force in the country. They've been the target of military offensives by the Americans and the British in the south and by the Germans in the north. But the Taliban are still capable of fighting back.
Of course, the lawyer Jirga will bring both parties of the conflict close to each other. Because the Taliban are one side in the conflict, we have to bring them to the Jirga so that we can find a national agreement on a solution to the problem.
But it remains to be seen whether Karzai will be able to fulfill his promise and if the Taliban will respond positively to his invitation. The Taliban don't recognize Karzai's government and still insist they are the only legitimate representatives of the Afghan people. By inviting the Taliban to join a lawyer Jirga to talk about the future of Afghanistan, President Karzai is trying to tell the world that he is the only person who has the potential to unify all the Afghan people behind one agenda. But the Taliban have been saying in the past that they are ready to join a national conference on the future of Afghanistan only when foreign forces leave the country. Hashim Al-Barra, Al Jazeera, Kabul.
Professor Lucas, if we could just pick up on that point about Karzai's manifesto, the lawyer Jirga that he's proposing to bring all the tribal leaders together to negotiate with the Taliban. If there was an Abdullah victory, would he be able to do something like that, to reach out to the Taliban? Because after all, he's not a Pashtun.
I think it'd be extremely difficult if there's an Abdullah victory to see that type of blueprint playing out. I think we almost, in a sense, walk into a set of unknowns. What happens with, let's say, the power relationships within Afghanistan? I think even the Americans, and I agree with your previous guest, it should all be about the people of Afghanistan, but there are powers that are interested in this. Even the Americans, I don't think, have done a game plan for this. They pretty much have put out the signal as well that they're open to talks, but they want to be in control of talks. They want to basically set the pace of who the Afghan government talks to and what's on the table. They have been talking to about this with Karzai, but I don't have any sense that they have talked about this with Abdullah. So I really think we walk into an unknown. If we do get his victory...
Let me put that point to you, Mr. Sultanzoy. Do you think it makes any difference which one of these men tries to reach out to the Taliban? Because I suppose Dr. Abdullah would argue that the Taliban won't engage with Karzai anyway because of his association with foreign powers, but then the Taliban could well see Dr. Abdullah in the same way because he was, after all, Karzai's foreign minister for 4 years.
I think whoever comes to power, or whoever wins the election, they should remember that lawyer Jirga, convening a lawyer Jirga in this country has already its own prerequisites described in the constitution of the country. They cannot bring people arbitrarily from wherever they want to. The membership and the participants of the lawyer Jirga are prescribed in the constitution of the country, and these memberships should come from within that definition. So promising lawyer Jirga to bring in the Taliban may sound very good, but what about the constitution and what about the definition of the lawyer Jirga? To go back to Mr. Abdullah or Mr. Karzai and how the Taliban will perceive them, only time will tell, because in politics you cannot go back and say that, well, the Taliban did not get along with this or that, or they had problems. The realities on the ground has changed in this country. The people of Afghanistan should be considered as the main arbiters of this country, and I think they need peace and stability and progress.
Well,
the international community is here.
You mentioned peace and stability, and that
realize.
actually leads me to my next point, because I want to turn now to the possibility of violence which could disrupt the election. No one knows what's going to happen, of course, but the authorities are on high alert. Professor Lucas, the Taliban released a statement about what they're going to do, saying that they will urge Afghans to boycott the election. They're going to block highways from the day before the election, and they're going to target polling stations. So actually, regardless of all the horse trading that's going on behind the scenes on who the front runners are in this election, could all of this come to very little given the risk of violence in the country?
Yeah, I think the recent estimate from international bodies who are looking at this is that about 10% of the vote may not even be returned, let alone be affected by this. Now, whether or not that estimate is entirely true when we get to election day, I think there's a broader question. And the fact is, this is a very large country, a very diverse country, and it's not just a question of whether the vote is disrupted by violence, but it's a question of how the count takes place. And does the count take place above board and fairly? And can it be observed and monitored? And I have to say that with all the political deals going on, this is what gives me concern, that I'd like to agree with your other guest, that the people of Afghanistan will get a fair hearing, that their voices will be heard on Election Day. But I think you're going to see a lot of politics not only before the vote, but about the vote itself. And it's going to be very difficult, beyond the violence, very difficult to establish transparency on this count.
Well, local Taliban commanders on the ground, Daud Sultanzoy, I put this point to you about the local Taliban, because villagers in the province of Maidan Wardak have told Al Jazeera that the Taliban have been saying that if they are found with the indelible voting ink on their finger, that the Taliban have said that they will cut their fingers off. So how are threats like that going to affect turnout in the election?
I think whether the Taliban can exercise that sort of an action or not is one thing, but the psychological effect of that kind of a threat is, I think, very, very effective. And I hope the people of Afghanistan can realize that this is their day. The government and the rest of the candidates have not done a good job in educating the people and reaching out to the people to reassure them. Psychological maneuvering by the Taliban and by others against the stability in this country has played a very effective role. To my chagrin, nothing has been done to counterbalance that or counteract that. And I think with all the televisions and media that we have in this country, we should have put that to good use to counteract that. That is a real threat and real fear, psychologically at least.
Sure. Professor Lucas, the other big cause of violence could come from those who feel that the election has been stolen from them. Observers have been saying that low turnout could pave the way for massive fraud, because election workers could simply fill in ballots for those people who don't show up.
I think there's a danger here because of what has happened in Iran, that some people are making comparisons between the two. And these are far different situations. To be cynical, and I'm afraid I am a cynic at times, you're going to see, let's say, political machines try to get their vote out on Election Day. And that's going to be the first battle. And indeed, I think, referring back to what your previous guest has said, I think that's been their emphasis. It doesn't matter if 15, 20, 25% of the vote does not come in if they get their voters to the polls. And I also think there will be a battle in terms of who controls the count. But statements, for example, which allegedly have been made by Dr. Abdullah, that he will challenge the vote if Karzai has a substantial win, and that this will be in Iran with Kalashnikovs, I think that's a little bit of posturing. I don't think it's very helpful posturing. And I frankly have to say that trying, at this point at least, to damp down the issue, damp down the possibilities of violence, even before we get to the vote, I would hope that would be the case over the next 10 to 12 days.
Daud Sultanzoy, if President Hamid Karzai does manage to gain a first-round victory, is there a danger, as Professor Lucas points out, that Dr. Abdullah's camp will simply not accept that result? In fact, they've already indicated as much, because they are just so disenchanted with Karzai that we would see a situation where people would take to the streets.
I hope that violence will not be the way to conduct our business in this country. We have to leave that to the past history. But I'm sure that if fraud is the case in this election, not only we will see quick repercussions, but in a few months, weeks and months, we will slowly see an attrition of confidence from the winner. Whoever has committed the fraud will completely lose confidence of the people, and the very little confidence that exists in this society towards the government and towards the state will completely dissipate. And again, for the past 2.5 centuries, this country has never been governed. It has been ruled, and this will again be an indication that people of Afghanistan want governance, but instead they get ruled, and that will not be a good taste in this new democracy.
Professor Lucas, just how important a factor is turnout going to be in this election, particularly in the Pashtun provinces in the south, which Karzai won in 2004, but where the Taliban now has the upper hand? Because in a way, we're in an impossible situation, because if Karzai does make a strong showing in those same provinces, it's going to arouse a great deal of concern, isn't it? Precisely because the Taliban is in control of those areas, and there have been reports of threats of violence and intimidation.
I think that underlying the question you've asked and the broader issue that exists is that in many respects, this country at least appears to be still a fragmented country. And I think to expect an election which is a unifying election with all the issues you've raised, I think that may be a step too far. I think what the hope is that at least if you get some type of election which is not completely, basically perfect, it is not ideal, but at least if the election can be held, and at least if it gives the prospect of some type of agreement between most of the parties involved, it gives you a breathing space to take on those wider questions. Because, to be honest with you, the phrase has always been that the Afghan government rules Kabul and very little beyond it. That's been used quite often since 2001. And the real challenge is, can it expand that zone of influence to get to a point where whether or not it sits down with the Taliban, there's some idea that it is an authority that is working with the people rather than ruling over it.
But is that even a possibility at this point? You say that just the fact an election can be held, some kind of process can take course, that it could be some measure of progress, no matter how small. But Dawood Sultanzoy, let me ask you, what are ordinary Afghans supposed to do? Because they've got the UN and Hamid Karzai telling them to go out and vote, but why on earth should they risk getting their fingers cut off or their throat slit for the sake of an election?
We are trying to tell the people in this country that this is their day. The election day is their day, and I think this country deserves a better day. And those who are candidates, they should realize that if the people do not participate in this election in reasonable numbers, the legitimacy of the future government will be totally dismantled, and I think we'll have a very tough time to govern in this country, let alone bring stability and progress and reconstruction. But also, this shows another thing, that we have started a process which is a very wonderful process: democracy, people participation, and also we have to be very optimistic that once you start a process like this, it's not going to be evolved overnight. It will be through growing pains that we will achieve a better democracy. But candidates and those who avail themselves to serve the people, they should truly mean that they're serving the people. They should garner the trust of the people, the confidence of the people, and that way they can bring the people into the process. Otherwise, by slogans and just rhetoric, people will not come to the fold. I think the candidates should have and could still do a better job in portraying that sincerity to the nation.
Well, thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for joining us. Dawood Sultanzoy in Kabul, and in Birmingham in the UK's Professor Scott Lucas. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.